Well, we're back with our old friend Chase Brown. This is, I think, like the third time in the last year that we've had Chase on. Of course, with Notre Dame playing at Ohio State last year, we talked to him before that game. We talked to him back in the spring after spring practice wrapped up for the Buckeyes. He's from 11warriors.com. Chase, as always, good to have you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm gonna miss talking to you. Ohio State's
Yeah,
not gonna play Notre Dame anymore, and
I know.
there'll be
We
no
might have to check in
conversations between us.
just for the fun of it.
Yeah,
Maybe maybe with the expanded playoff coming here in the near future, maybe they end up crossing paths again sometime soon. Who knows?
yeah, well, that'd be great.
I mean, I think the fan bases might like it anyway. So, well, last year's game was really ultra hyped. I think in part because it started off the season and it had been so long since the two programs had played just in the regular season. It had been since 1996, and Notre Dame's played 4 games at this point. Ohio State's played 3 games, and I don't know what it feels like from that side, but especially from a fan standpoint here. I mean, I think everyone's really kind of has essentially been looking at this as the start of the season, even though it's a few games in this time. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. It's last season with the game being in week one, it felt like all of the anticipation, all of the hype of the season was then toppled on with the addition to the Notre Dame game. It's an exciting start to the season for both fan bases because it was a top 10 matchup. Actually, I think it was a top 5 matchup at the time.
Right.
And that in itself is exciting. Now you kind of have a little bit of buildup. Both teams have certain expectations for what they've put on film and what they've shown fans so far. So it's a different way to approach the game this time around, but I still think that excitement is at an all-time high.
A lot of talk on this end about what the stadium is going to look like Saturday night. Is it going to be a sea of red? We've seen that a few times here historically, going back to Nebraska in 2000, Georgia in 2017. And there was Cincinnati was not as strong as either one of those two fan bases turning out. Are you expecting a very large turnout from Ohio State this weekend here in South Bend?
I would think so. I mean, there always is for Ohio State's road game because, sort of the trademark of Ohio State or its nickname is Buckeye Nation, right? There's Ohio State fans
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. That includes South Bend. And I think that because the distance between Columbus and South Bend is manageable for people to drive maybe in a day, maybe do a stay over on Saturday night and leave and come back on Sunday morning, that a good contingent of Ohio State fans will be at the game. I know that with the green out happening, that there's going to be an extra incentive for Ohio State fans to sort of group together and maybe wear a certain color. Scarlet's probably the one that they would wear because that cuts through that green, right? So I think that Ohio State fans may be up to the challenge. It'll just depend on how many were able to get tickets, because I know that the system for getting tickets may be a little bit different with Notre Dame than it is here for Ohio State. But I do think that there was an incentive for Ohio State fans to make that trip, and then obviously to try and cut through that green out that Notre Dame may be having.
And Notre Dame has tried to do, because of some of those past cases that I just mentioned, Notre Dame has tried to do everything they can from a ticketing standpoint to make it as difficult as possible. But you know how the secondary ticket market works. I'll be really curious to see how far that actually goes.
Yeah, it's something where, again, we talked about coming into this. It's such a highly anticipated matchup that it seems like really for Ohio State fans, if we look at their schedule, it's one of the biggest games on the schedule. You have Notre Dame, you have Wisconsin, which will be a road game in Madison. You have a home game against Penn State, and then you have the Michigan game up in Ann Arbor. So this really is the most, I guess it's the most anticipated matchup, obviously this early in the season, but it's also one outside of the Penn State game, which will be at home, that could probably be the most attainable for people to travel to and for tickets to be somewhat affordable. There's probably not going to be many Ohio State fans that'll make that trip to Madison. And then obviously the trip to Ann Arbor, that's a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? Those tickets are,
Right.
if somebody has it, they're holding on to it. They're probably not selling it. So this is an opportunity, I think, for Ohio State fans to see a marquee game for a relatively decent price, while also being able to travel a short distance to be able to watch the Buckeyes.
Yeah, don't have to worry about airfare and that kind of stuff, obviously, if you're
Yeah.
actually in Ohio. So, well, let's talk about some specifics, some personnel in this game. The last time we talked, it was Kyle McCord and Devin Brown that, they were kind of trying to figure out who was going to be the quarterback. It obviously turned out to be McCord. He has started all 3 games, and this will be his 5th career start coming in here this weekend. How would you describe what you've seen from him through these first 3 games?
It's been a progression. And I think that Ryan Day had some comments about that today in his press conference, that Kyle McCord has grown in each opportunity that he's taken the field for Ohio State. The Indiana game was rough. He didn't complete a lot of passes that he probably should have. It didn't seem like he was able to extend the field by throwing over the top of the defense. And then, Youngstown State comes around where he's able to perform well, but in a short sample size, because Ohio State was still experimenting with that 2-quarterback system between McCord and Brown. But now, as he faces Western Kentucky this past weekend, he's QB1. He's the guy that Ohio State turned to for all of its first-team reps, and he performed really well. 19 of 23, 318 yards, 3 touchdowns. He didn't have to work too hard to hit Marvin Harrison Jr. on that 75-yard go route. He was pretty wide open. But there were a couple of really nice throws. He had some good decision making when it came to throwing the ball to Emeka Egbuka a couple of times. He hit Cade Stover on some really nice curl routes, some nice crossing routes as well. It seemed like Kyle McCord, just as time has gone on, has gotten more comfortable. But again, that's happening against Indiana, against Youngstown State, against Western Kentucky, not against an opponent the caliber of Notre Dame. So I'll be very curious to see how he enters into this road environment, going up against a top 10 team, a formidable defense. There's obviously going to be first-year jitters. There's going to be some first-year bumps and bruises maybe along the way, but establishing the run will be huge for Ohio State, for getting Kyle McCord comfortable so that he can work off the play action. He really thrives off of that style of play. He thrives off of getting the ball to his receivers in open space. So I think Ohio State's really going to try and lean on the run and allow Kyle McCord to get comfortable that way.
I think we talked last year about C.J. Stroud and the start of C.J. Stroud's career. It wasn't necessarily all roses. There were some bumps in the road for him early on, and obviously over time it worked out. I think it always helps when you have all those NFL caliber receivers around you. But
right.
But is there anything like, is there a comparison to the way Stroud's career started and what you've seen from McCord so far, or is it completely different?
I think so. I think it's just trust, right? Like, Ryan Day has to trust that his quarterback can make the routine plays routinely. That's a buzzword or a buzz phrase, maybe we'll call it, that Ryan Day uses all of the time. It's his quarterback needs to make the routine plays routinely. They need to take care of the football. And Kyle McCord has done that so far, or at least as time has gone on. Indiana, maybe not so much. Youngstown State, there is a couple of bumps in the road. But Western Kentucky, he really showed that what the defense is going to give him, he will take. And I think that what helps him, as you mentioned, having Marvin Harrison Jr., having Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming, even the development of guys like Xavier Johnson, freshman Carnell Tate, Cade Stover, out of the backfield, Travion Henderson and Chip Trayanum. The Ohio State just has weapons around him that they will use, and that they will try and find ways to get the balls in their hands. And I think that is something that has helped McCord as time has gone on, is just being able to see the weapons around him, very similar to how C.J. Stroud was able to lean on Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba, guys like that. It's just, you just got to let these guys make plays. You don't need to do anything that's extraordinary. You don't need to do anything that's going to maybe get you on SportsCenter top 10. It's just deliver the ball to them in space and let them go to work. And I think that the more he adopts that mindset, the more successful he'll become.
Because of he's got 1 interception, but because of the competition that you mentioned that he's played so far, it doesn't seem like he's made any fatal mistakes. Does it feel like, not necessarily bubble wrap, but does it feel at the same time like they've tried to protect him as much as possible?
I think so. The 1 interception did happen on sort of an awkward play, I guess, where they were on 4th and short. They ran a play action play where the ball was designed to go to Chip Trayanum coming out of the backfield. And an Indiana defender made a really nice play to sort of chip, for pun intended,
Uh-huh.
Got him out of the play. And then Kyle McCord on fourth down just needs to make something happen. He does sort of he makes a bad decision by throwing across his body into the middle of the field. Indiana intercepts the ball. But in that instance, he didn't settle by taking a sack or just tried to make a play. But outside of that, it seems like his decision-making has been sound in a lot of instances, just getting the ball where, again, the defense has allowed him to get the ball. Whatever the defense is offering him, I think that Kyle McCord has done a really nice job over the past couple of weeks of just, delivering the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr. in space, delivering the ball to Emeka Egbuka in space, and just letting those guys work, just getting them an opportunity to catch the pass and then gain a couple of extra yards and keep those chains moving.
You mentioned Devin Brown and that sort of experiment, I guess. Is that completely a thing of, is that in their past now? Like, do you expect any Devin Brown this Saturday night?
I don't think so. Ohio State, they named Kyle McCord their definitive full-time starter, and I think that decision was made before the Western Kentucky game for the purpose of getting Kyle McCord ready for this Notre Dame game, to sort of allow Kyle McCord this past weekend to stop looking over his shoulder, to stop worrying about whether or not this will be his last possession before Devin Brown comes in the game. I think what they really need, and I think what Ohio State wants to do, is establish the run, get Kyle McCord in a rhythm, and then go from there. To take Kyle McCord out of his rhythm by inserting Devin Brown at any point could really inhibit what Ohio State wants to do offensively. And I think you saw that almost with Ohio State's first two results when they were operating out of that two-quarterback system. They only scored 23 points against Indiana. They scored 35 points against Youngstown State. They come out with one quarterback, with Kyle McCord, in week 3 against Western Kentucky and score 63 points. That is an incredible achievement by any stretch, but also just by the fact that Ohio State was operating sort of in this disjointed, this clunky system offensively out of the first 2 weeks. And then they really exploded in week 3 against Western Kentucky.
Offensive line was probably the biggest concern coming out of the spring. They lost 3 starters from last year's team. How do you think they've looked so far? I've heard kind of maybe not as impressive. The first couple games looked better against Western Kentucky last week. How would you evaluate it?
From my perspective, I think the pass blocking has been decent. The run blocking is where Ohio State really needs to improve. Ohio State recruits very big, very tall, somewhat stiff offensive linemen, it seems. And the reason I say that is because they are all very talented when it comes to defending the pass rush, which makes sense considering how much Ohio State wants to pass the ball and how much Ryan Day wants his quarterbacks to operate out of the pocket. But when it comes to getting those guys moving, specifically when it comes to, Ohio State really relies on this stretch run concept. Not so much the gap blocking of having a running back push through the middle of the offensive line. They want Travion Henderson and Chip Trayanum and Mine Williams to get outside the tackle to really stretch the defense that way so that then they can work the pass game in. And for those tall, those heavy offensive linemen, to get them moving sideways, to get them moving off of their initial blockers to the second level has been a challenge. Now, I think that against Western Kentucky, they improved a little bit in that area, but you kind of have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because Western Kentucky's rush defense at the time was ranking below, I believe it was around 115 to 120 range nationally, after getting torched by USF and then Houston Christian in those first 2 weeks. So, going up against Notre Dame's front will be a totally different kind of challenge. I think they'll probably hold up fine in the pass rush and blocking for the pass. But when it really comes to establishing the run, that's the key, right? That's the key for Ohio State opening up the pass game. They're going to really need to rely on Travion Henderson and Chip Trayanum and that running back room to get 3 or 4 yards a carry each time so that they can open up opportunities for Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka. And that starts with the offensive line getting that push up front.
I mean, is this, when you look at this matchup this weekend, is this the biggest concern you think that they have going into this game?
I would agree. Yeah, I would say so. Ohio State's defense has looked really good so far. I think the biggest question with the defense was how would they defend against the pass attack, the level of Western Kentucky, and they proved themselves worthy last week with how they defended Austin Reed and Malachi Corley and that whole group of receivers. There is a threat that Sam Hartman and the Notre Dame receivers possess. Absolutely, like Notre Dame. They will not overlook how talented the Irish are in that area of the game. But in terms of how the defense has responded to those questions so far this season, I would say that most Ohio State fans feel at least somewhat comfortable going into this game. But with the offensive line, I feel like most of the fan base is still wondering, do they have it? Is the chemistry all there? Is the 5 offensive linemen that they're using the most talented? Are the 5 offensive linemen that they're using able to defend Notre Dame's rush, not only in the pass, but also, as we just talked about, in the run game? Are they going to be able to push and get the running backs an opportunity to gain 3 or 4 yards a carry and to keep the chains moving? I would say that the offensive line right now has improved each week, similar to Kyle McCord, but this is going to be their most significant test yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same for Notre Dame, even though I don't know. First half of Central Michigan last week, there were some questions. Things worked out okay in the second half. You kind of led me into what I was going to ask about next, and that is the defense with Jim Knowles going into in his second year now as defensive coordinator. And again, they've looked good against the teams that they've played so far. When we talked in the spring, you talked about they've got to be better in the matchup games. In other words, the bigger competition matchup type games. And so I guess how much do you expect to find out about that side of the ball in this specific matchup with Notre Dame?
A lot. It's Notre Dame's offensive line. I think I just saw that Joe Alt was named the Outland Player of the Week for his performance against Central Michigan. Ohio State hasn't faced an offensive lineman like that. And Notre Dame's got a whole bunch of them, right? So I think that Ohio State's production, specifically on the defensive line, has been lacking a little bit in the first 3 weeks. A lot of people were pointing out that JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer didn't have a sack in the first 2 weeks, which was primarily brushed off by many of the people inside the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, inside the Ohio State program, primarily because Indiana and Youngstown State didn't throw the ball very much. But then Western Kentucky comes around, throws the ball a bunch. Still, those guys don't have sacks, but now at least we have some record of, okay, they got a couple of quarterback pressures. Tuimoloau and Sawyer combined for 13 quarterback pressures against Western Kentucky. Tyleik Williams got a sack in the backfield. Mike Hall got a tackle for loss. So some of the production, you started to see it against a team that was actually willing to throw the ball, and maybe a team that, we might categorize as Western Kentucky wasn't at least trying to lose close. They were trying to win in many instances, which allowed them to be a little bit more aggressive and allowed Ohio State's defensive ends to generate a little bit more pressure. So I think that what I would like to see, and what a lot of people will be looking forward to seeing from Ohio State's defensive line, is just, will Sam Hartman operate out of a comfortable pocket the entire game, right? Will there be opportunities where Tuimoloau or Sawyer, Tyleik Williams, and Mike Hall, are they getting in the backfield and at least creating pressure? Sacks may be an overblown stat when it comes to how disruptive a defensive line can be, but will Sam Hartman be uncomfortable? Will he be maybe a little bit nervous in the pocket when he sees number 44 coming around the corner, or sees Jack Sawyer in his face as he's trying to complete a pass to one of his receivers? That's going to be huge for Ohio State. And then also with just stopping the run game in many instances. Estime is a very talented running back. So making him uncomfortable as well once he receives a handoff from Hartman or receives a pitch or whatever, just getting into the backfield and making them uncomfortable, keeping Notre Dame's offense, making them sustain long drives to score, I think is what Ohio State ultimately wants to achieve, is knowing that you're not going to hold Notre Dame to 0 points. But when they do get points, having your defensive line generate enough disruption, enough uncomfortability that these drives that result in 3 or 7 points take a long time, and that Notre Dame is uncomfortable the entire time.
It's funny because I think when you look at these teams, they're kind of mirrors on both sides of the ball in terms of what the questions are, because Notre Dame does have some questions with its offensive line, and the flip side, the pass rush is the same thing. They haven't generated a lot of sacks so far, but they're number one in the country in pass efficiency defense right now. So and it's the same thing. You know, how much Marcus Freeman was talking about it yesterday. How, you know, he said he would take the number one pass efficiency. I think that you know, probably quietly he would take a few more sacks here and there though as well, some pressures.
Right. You want game-changing plays. Yeah, like
Right.
you want your star players to have opportunities to alter games by sacks, by forced fumbles, tackles for loss, whether it's your defensive backs or your linebackers, whoever, getting some pass breakups. You want plays that get your defense going, that lift the energy and the spirits of your team. But as we know, that's just one facet of the game. As Freeman was talking about in his press conference, you know, being efficient as a defense maybe doesn't always result in numbers that show up in the box score. It could also just be a matter of how uncomfortable are you making an offense as they're trying to drive down the field and score on your defense. And I think you're right in saying that Freeman and Ryan Day and Jim Knowles have a very similar philosophy in that way. You know, you understand that in a top 10 matchup, it's going to be a dogfight for 4 quarters. It's going to be a matter of how disruptive are you, regardless of how many stats show up in the box score when that game is over.
It's funny. We were talking before we started about how in the past Marcus Freeman has said some things about his alma mater, Ohio State, that Ohio State fans didn't necessarily take to very well. He didn't go there with any of the questions that he had yesterday. Are Buckeye fans kind of like, do they have scorecards out anytime Marcus Freeman potentially is going to talk about Ohio State?
Not as much as Desmond Howard. We can say that much.
Yeah, that's. I think
Ohio State
I think
fans,
that's something that the two fan bases can both agree on.
Certainly, yeah. Desmond Howard is always on Ohio State fans' radar, but Marcus Freeman, no. I think that most Ohio State fans understand that he's learning on the job. You know, at this point, he hasn't said anything, you know, that's been derogatory or has been, you know, has really altered the way that Ohio State fans look at him, right? He hasn't done anything to that magnitude. But it may add a little bit of extra juice to the matchup, you know, from some Ohio State fans, you know, well, they'll take anything and run with it. You know, Kirk Herbstreit's talked a lot about that kind of fan base here in Ohio State, right, with the 15%ers, the bunch of Ohio State fans that'll be mad about anything. You know, they're the fans that are upset about Marcus Freeman's comments right now. I think most fans, though, are kind of in the perspective that, you know, it's going to be a good game on Saturday, and that no matter the result, that, you know, Marcus Freeman's still a Buckeye. He's still somebody that gave his blood, sweat, and tears to Ohio State for a couple of years, playing under Jim Tressel, and that'll always be important, and that they understand that Marcus Freeman still loves and thinks fondly of that time.
Lorenzo Styles, of course, transferred from here to there after the spring. It doesn't look like he's played so far. I assume we're probably not expecting to see him Saturday.
I don't think so. You know, we've been kind of wondering the same thing, the media contingent here, about what Ohio State plans to do with him. You know, he made that switch from wide receiver to cornerback, and he seems to be developing well from all the conversations that we've had about him with the secondary coach, Tim Walton, and with Jim Knowles and Ryan Day. But right now it seems like he's specifically doing special teams activities, being on special teams units. Whether or not he'll surpass that 4-game limit for a red shirt, that's something that's still to be decided. I think that that's probably the direction that Ohio State's heading with him, just to give him some extra time to develop at corner after making that switch. Though that's kind of just my interpretation of the events that are currently playing out. I wouldn't say that that's anything official. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that you should expect to see Lorenzo Styles on Saturday. I think that Ohio State's pretty content with running Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, Jordan Hancock, and Jair Brown out of that cornerback room for right now.
All right. Sounds good. Chase Brown, 11warriors.com, getting ready for Notre Dame and Ohio State. Hey, thanks again, Chase. Great stuff as always. It's always great talking to you. And, like I said, maybe they schedule another series down the line, or they play in the playoff at some point. We'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.